Well, welcome back to Justice Redesigned. Steve Teskey, your host, retired judge. And we are still moving forward on this series, the Compact for Obedience. Remember the last episode, which was supposed to be the concluding episode? I told you that that may not be the case. There were new developments, and those developments have continued. So this is what I call like an epilogue to the series and bringing you up to date on new developments and therefore hopefully bring in some new clarity. So let's get into it. Um, and as I stated when I began this 5 episode series, this compact for obedience, I thought I was done. And as I had said, I've taped 5 episodes. Um, and in new reporting that's gone on recently in the papers and in the electronic media, there have been new university responses. And I mentioned the last episode there were already some coming in that were rejecting the compact. And remember, I stated about 3 episodes ago that I thought most of them, if not all the universities, would reject them. And including a very powerful letter that I want to talk about in this episode from the president of the University of Arizona, made it very clear, okay, this story isn't over. In fact, it's evolving in ways that demand one more chapter. And maybe I may need to do another one as things develop, because who knows in these twists and turns where it's going to end up. So, as I said, think of this as an epilogue, a post series note, or to borrow from literature, the part of the book where the fog lifts and the true shape of the landscape finally comes into view. So, let's start. The first section of this episode is universities are standing up, and they're saying no. First, some good news. Of the 9 universities initially contacted by the Trump administration about the proposed compact, 7 rejected it outright, okay, according to the New York Times reporting and other news outlets. Not quietly, not cautiously, but flatly rejected on principle. These include Brown University, Dartmouth, MIT, Penn, University of Arizona, USC, and the University of Virginia. Only Vanderbilt expressed partial interest, and University of Texas at Austin showed limited openness. But even those responses were tepid at best. This is a remarkable moment, ladies and gentlemen. American universities, described by critics as timid, bureaucratic, and overly cautious, suddenly rediscovered their spine. They stood together and said what needed to be said. No president, no administration, and no billionaire gets to dictate the boundaries of academic freedom. So let's talk about the wealthy ideologues and the White House strategy. The deeper reporting shows something else. This compact was not an academic proposal. It was a billionaire's blueprint carried straight into the Oval Office. Mark Rowan didn't just influence this policy, he co-wrote it, shaped who received it, and stood on White House calls defending it directly to university leaders. The series of articles lays out the pattern clearly. Billionaires oust presidents at Penn and Harvard. Billionaires pressure institutions to discipline faculty. Billionaires shape federal policy aimed at coercing universities into ideological conformity. Folks, this is not philanthropy. This is not governance. This is ideological leverage disguised as reform. As former presidents Janet uh, Napolitano and Lee Bollinger warned, that is, presidents of universities, this level of private influence is, quote, way out of proportion, end quote, to any legitimate critique of higher education. Now, I mentioned the University of Arizona in my opening. To me, their response was a model response. Um, the University of Arizona, a place deeply personal to me. It's my father's alma mater, as well as that of many of my relatives. I had an uncle who graduated from the University of Arizona Law School, would go on and become a Superior Court judge and retired Superior Court judge out of Maricopa County, that is Phoenix. I have a cousin who is currently a Superior Court judge there in Maricopa County. I have another cousin who, uh, went on to the Attorney General's office for the state of Arizona. Now, so I take a great pride with Arizona's response, but the president there sent a letter, okay, and it's framed in a way that I call it a master class in principled leadership. It recognizes areas of agreement, the transparency, the tuition concerns, the merit-based admissions, but it does so without surrendering a single inch of institutional autonomy. His letter says, in effect, quote, "We share your goals, but we will not compromise the foundational principles that make higher education a cornerstone of a free society," end quote. Okay, that's a letter written by the president on October 20th. It's dated October 20th, 2025. He then attaches the university's statement of principles, a document built on 1. Academic freedom, 2. Civil discourse, 3. Research independence, 4. Viewpoint neutrality in enforcement, and lastly, and a deep commitment to merit and student success. The university affirms, and in the letter, quote, "Academic freedom undergirds the right of faculty to teach free from unreasonable or arbitrary restrictions." Exactly the opposite of what the compact demanded. So this brings me back to Mark Rowan. He repeatedly argues that academic freedom is not absolute. This claim, repeated in his New York Times guest essay and echoed in the compact language, reveals a deep misunderstanding of the First Amendment doctrine. And it's time to clear this up. All speech is not equal. I know that. Rowan is correct that some speech is not fully protected. For example, incitement to violence is not protected. True threats, like "I'm going to kill you," that's not protected. Fighting words, in certain categories of commercial speech, like pornography, that's why these things can be regulated. That's why it's a crime. I know in my home state of Georgia, I say home state where I was raised and went to college, although I was born in Arizona, terroristic threats, okay? Um, that's a crime. You can't threaten to kill somebody, even if you don't mean it, all right? Um, and as a result, just like I just described, they receive lower protections under the First Amendment, some of which receive no protection, and it's a crime. But this is the part Rowan appears to miss. The Supreme Court has drawn a bright constitutional line. Political, social, and academic discourse constitute the core of the First Amendment, and attempts to suppress them face the highest level of scrutiny, whoever tries to do that. Like in this case, the Trump administration. And they have to apply various types of tests. The one most common we hear of is the strict scrutiny test, okay? There's the rational basis, the intermediate, but then the strict scrutiny applies whenever there is a fundamental right that one is alleged being violated, which would include the rights in the First Amendment, that is freedom of speech, freedom of the press, okay? And basically it goes like this, okay? If uh, is if there is a uh, compelling state interest versus the other tests, which are do not involve fundamental. Is there a legitimate state interest? But when it's strict scrutiny, there has to be a compelling state interest. And even if there is a compelling state interest, then whatever restrictions are being imposed on that right must be narrowly tailored to achieve its ends. Okay. But in some of these free speech cases, it's sometimes hard to get past a compelling state interest. Okay. Um, Now, certainly it is when you're talking about those forms of speech that do not receive the absolute protection, do not fall under Congress shall make no law. That is what the founders meant to be protecting political and social type of speech. That includes academic freedom. But if it's type of speech other than that, like commercial speech, that's why we have the FAA to regulate that. You can't go around using vulgar words on radio, especially during daytime where kids can hear it. All right. So I hope you are understanding these distinctions in free speech. Okay. And the bright line that the Supreme Court has drawn. Academic expression is not commercial speech. It's not entertainment. It's not advertising. It is the speech the First Amendment was designed to protect, limited to social and political speech, not commercial speech, not speech that threatens to hurt and harm people. Okay? So the court's been explicit. Academic freedom is a special concern of the First Amendment. Keishian versus Board of Regents, 1967, went back and spoke about that in episode 1 and 2. Why? Because academia is where society explores, challenges, and tests ideas that government power may find uncomfortable or even threatening. Rowan conflates, quote, not all speech is protected, with academic speech is only partially protected. That is not how the doctrine works. Now, let me talk to you about another person who is one of the nation's leading constitutional scholars, and that is Erwin uh, Chernetsky. Okay, he put it bluntly: "This is extortion, plain and simple." And I'm quoting him in his own opinion piece a few weeks ago. He points directly to one, the unconstitutional conditions doctrine that we've already talked about in episode 2, the coercive use of federal funds, and the explicit viewpoint discrimination embedded in the text, which we also spoke about in episode 2. Now, his conclusion is as unambiguous as the Constitution itself. He said, and I'm quoting Chemerinsky, okay, the future of higher education requires that every university reject it, okay? And basically they have now, as I'm reporting here today in this episode, which is why this moment matters. So, what does the road ahead look like? And why does this epilogue matter? I started this series warning that the compact was not about excellence, it was about obedience. Now we have confirmation from both the reporting and the universities themselves. One, the compact was designed by private financiers with political goals. It attempted to coerce universities into ideological conformity. 3, it contradicted centuries of First Amendment doctrine. And lastly, and it was overwhelmingly rejected. That rejection is not resistance for resistance' sake. It is patriotism. It is constitutional fidelity. It is institutional integrity. Higher education isn't perfect. Yes, it needs reform in cost, access, transparency, and governance. But those reforms must take place within the Constitution, not outside it. The First Amendment does not bend to the political preferences of wealthy men with strong opinions about universities. It does not yield to presidential pressure. It does not alter itself depending on which ideology feels threatened. It begins with a command: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Academic freedom lives in that sentence. And thanks to the universities who stood up, it lives still. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for listening. I'm grateful to each and every one of you. Um, until the next time, please be safe and take care.